I was staring at my phone in complete disbelief when the certified letter arrived, wondering how a simple business decision could spiral into the nightmare that would consume the next 6 months of my life. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and bore the return address of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, the organization that had made my existence increasingly miserable since I moved to this subdivision in Henderson, Nevada, 3 years ago. My name is Frank Brennan, and I run a small but successful industrial safety consulting firm from my home office. The work pays well, allows me flexibility, and most importantly, it lets me be there for my teenage daughter Sarah when she needs me. After my divorce 2 years back, that flexibility became essential. What I never imagined was that my profession would become the focal point of an HOA vendetta that would eventually involve OSHA, multiple lawyers, and ultimately, criminal charges. The letter was from Brenda Morrison, the HOA president, a woman whose very name had become synonymous with petty tyranny throughout our neighborhood. She was 52, drove a white Mercedes SUV, and had perfected the art of weaponizing homeowner association bylaws against anyone who dared to live their life differently than her narrow vision permitted. I had seen her reduce grown men to apologizing for parking their work trucks on their own driveways and force families to repaint their homes because the shade of beige was 2% off the approved color palette. I tore open the envelope and began reading. The letter demanded that I provide the HOA with detailed copies of my propane safety protocols, storage procedures, and emergency response plans within 14 days. The reason cited was that my home-based business posed a potential hazard to the community, and therefore the HOA board required full disclosure of all safety measures as a condition of continued residence. My blood ran cold. The propane safety protocols they were demanding were proprietary information, developed over years of consulting work with Fortune 500 companies. These weren't just generic safety guidelines you could download from the internet. They represented thousands of hours of research, field testing, and refinement. Companies paid me substantial fees to develop customized safety systems, and the methodologies I used were trade secrets that gave my business its competitive edge. I grabbed my phone and called my business attorney, Marcus Chen, who had helped me set up the LLC when I first started the company. He answered on the third ring. "Marcus, I need your help. The HOA is demanding I turn over proprietary business information, and they are threatening me with violation fines if I do not comply." Marcus listened as I explained the situation, occasionally interrupting with questions. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Frank, this is either incredible stupidity on their part or a calculated move to force you out. Have you had any previous conflicts with this HOA board?" I laughed bitterly. "Where do I start? Last year they fined me because my grass was a 1/4 inch too tall when I was traveling for work. 6 months ago, they tried to prohibit me from having client meetings at my home, claiming it violated the residential use restrictions, even though my lawyer sent them documentation proving otherwise. Brenda Morrison has been looking for a reason to come after me ever since I opposed her motion to ban all home-based businesses entirely." "Okay, so this is personal," Marcus said. "Here is what we are going to do. First, do not respond to this letter yet. Second, I am going to draft a response explaining that the information they are requesting constitutes trade secrets protected under Nevada law. Third, and this is important, I want you to contact OSHA and get their opinion on this matter. If a federal agency tells them this information is protected, that carries a lot more weight than just your attorney saying so." The next morning, I called the Las Vegas OSHA field office and explained my situation to a compliance officer named Robert Mendoza. He listened patiently, asked me several detailed questions about the nature of my business and the specific information being requested, and then said something that would prove crucial in the months ahead. "Mr. Brennan, the safety protocols and proprietary methodologies you have developed for your consulting business are absolutely protected information. They fall under the category of trade secrets, and you are under no obligation to disclose them to a homeowners association or any other private entity. In fact, I would advise against it. These protocols represent your competitive advantage in the marketplace, and sharing them could seriously harm your business interests. I am going to document this conversation and send you a formal letter stating OSHA position on this matter. That should carry some weight with your HOA." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. One more thing," Robert added. "If this HOA continues to harass you over this issue, particularly if they try to impose fines or other penalties, you may want to consider filing a complaint. What they are doing could constitute tortious interference with your business operations. Document everything." 3 days later, the OSHA letter arrived. It was beautifully worded, professional, and unequivocal. The letter stated that proprietary safety protocols developed by private consulting firms were considered trade secrets, and that there was no legitimate reason for a homeowners association to require disclosure of such information. Furthermore, the letter noted that OSHA regulations already provided adequate oversight of businesses handling hazardous materials, and redundant disclosure requirements could actually undermine safety by encouraging the widespread distribution of sensitive security information. Armed with this letter and a formal response drafted by Marcus, I attended the next HOA board meeting. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige stucco building that matched every other structure in our relentlessly uniform neighborhood. About 30 homeowners were in attendance, most of them looking bored or resigned to another evening of Brenda Morrison's autocratic rule. Brenda sat at the head table flanked by 4 other board members: Todd Peterson, the treasurer; Linda Shaw, the secretary; Gary Williams, a perpetually nervous man who seemed terrified of contradicting Brenda; and Susan Martinez, the only board member who occasionally showed signs of independent thought. After the usual preliminaries about landscaping standards and parking violations, Brenda turned her attention to me. Her expression was one of barely concealed triumph. Item 7 on tonight's agenda concerns Mr. Frank Brennan's non-compliance with the board's reasonable request for safety documentation. Mr. Brennan, have you prepared the requested materials? I stood up, holding the OSHA letter and Marcus's response. I have not provided the materials you requested because they constitute proprietary business information. However, I have brought documentation from OSHA explaining why your request is not only unreasonable but potentially harmful to my business interests. I walked forward and handed copies to each board member. Brenda snatched hers and began reading, her face reddening as she progressed through the letter. "This is absurd," she snapped. "OSHA has no authority over homeowners associations. We have the right to ensure the safety of our community, and that means having full disclosure of any potentially hazardous activities conducted within the subdivision. With respect, Mrs. Morrison, OSHA absolutely has authority over workplace safety matters, which is what my business involves. Furthermore, my attorney's letter, which is also included in the packet I just distributed, explains that Nevada trade secret law protects this information. You have no legal right to demand it, and any penalties you impose for my refusal to provide it would expose the HOA to substantial legal liability. Susan Martinez raised her hand. Brenda, maybe we should have the HOA attorney review this before we proceed. This seems like it could be a legal minefield. Brenda shot her a withering look. We do not need an attorney to tell us that safety comes first. Mr. Brennan, you have 2 weeks to comply with our request, or we will begin assessing daily fines of $200 per day until you do. The room erupted in murmurs. Several homeowners looked shocked at the amount. I kept my voice calm but firm. Mrs. Morrison, I will not be providing this information, and if you proceed with these fines, I will have no choice but to take legal action against the HOA. You are demanding proprietary business information that you have no legal right to access, and you are threatening my livelihood to do it. We will see what a judge has to say about that, Brenda replied coldly. This meeting is adjourned. The next day, I received an email from the HOA's management company officially notifying me that fines would begin accruing in 14 days if I did not comply. I forwarded the email to Marcus, who immediately filed a motion for a temporary restraining order to prevent the HOA from imposing the fines while the matter was litigated. The judge assigned to our case was the Honorable Patricia Gonzalez, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for being tough but fair. The hearing on the temporary restraining order was scheduled for 2 weeks out, which meant the HOA's deadline would pass before we got our day in court. True to their word, the HOA began assessing fines. I received a letter stating that I owed $200 for the first day of non-compliance, with the amount increasing by $200 each subsequent day. I did not pay a cent, knowing that this was part of their strategy to either force me to comply or drive me into bankruptcy. The preliminary hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in late March. The courthouse in Henderson was busy as always, with various civil matters being adjudicated throughout the building. Our case was called at 10 in the morning, and I sat next to Marcus at the plaintiff's table, while the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man named Richard Goldstein, sat across from us with Brenda Morrison beside him. Judge Gonzalez reviewed the filings, asked several pointed questions, and then rendered her decision. I am granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA is prohibited from assessing any further fines against Mr. Brennan pending resolution of this matter. Furthermore, Mr. Brennan is not required to pay the fines already assessed until after a full hearing on the merits. This appears to be a clear case of the HOA overstepping its authority, but we will let that play out in the proper forum. Next hearing is scheduled for June 15th. Brenda's face went through several shades of red as the judge spoke. As we left the courtroom, she cornered me in the hallway. You think you are so smart, don't you? You and your fancy attorney and your OSHA letters. Let me tell you something, Mr. Brennan. This neighborhood has standards, and people like you who think the rules don't apply to them do not belong here. I will make sure you regret fighting this. Marcus stepped between us. Mrs. Morrison, I would strongly advise you to stop speaking. Any further harassment of my client could result in additional legal action. She stormed off, but her threat lingered in my mind. I knew Brenda Morrison was not the type to back down just because a judge told her to. She would find other ways to make my life difficult, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Over the following weeks, the HOA's retaliation began in earnest. I received violation notices for increasingly absurd infractions. My mailbox was allegedly the wrong shade of black. A small crack in my driveway was cited as a major structural deficiency requiring immediate repair. The pine tree in my front yard was supposedly diseased and needed to be removed at my expense, despite a certified arborist's report stating the tree was perfectly healthy. Each violation came with its own fine, and while the temporary restraining order protected me from the propane-related penalties, these new violations were technically separate issues. I was hemorrhaging money fighting each spurious claim, and the stress was taking a toll on both my business and my personal life, Sarah noticed. One evening over dinner, she put down her fork and looked at me with concern in her eyes. "Dad, you look terrible. Is everything okay?" I tried to smile reassuringly. "Just some business stuff, honey. Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it the HOA thing? I heard you on the phone with your lawyer yesterday. They are still bothering you about that propane information, aren't they?" I sighed. There was no point in hiding it from her. She was 16 and smart enough to know when something was wrong. "Yeah, they are making things difficult, but we are handling it through the proper legal channels. It will work out." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why do they even care about your business stuff? It does not affect them at all." "Honestly, I think Mrs. Morrison just doesn't like that I stood up to her. Some people can't handle anyone questioning their authority." "She sounds like a real piece of work," Sarah said, then added, "Sorry, I know I shouldn't talk about adults that way." I laughed despite myself. "In this case, you are not wrong." The weeks leading up to the June hearing were a blur of depositions, document requests, and legal maneuvering. Marcus subpoenaed all HOA board meeting minutes from the past 3 years, looking for patterns of discriminatory enforcement or personal vendettas. What we found was eye-opening. Brenda Morrison had used her position to target at least 7 other homeowners who had crossed her in various ways. One family was driven to sell their home after racking up $30,000 in fines for violations that other homeowners routinely committed without penalty. Another homeowner, a retired teacher who had questioned Brenda's handling of the HOA budget, suddenly found himself facing weekly inspections and citations for problems that had existed for years without issue. The pattern was clear. Cross Brenda Morrison, and she would use every tool at her disposal to make your life miserable. Marcus was building a case not just for the propane issue, but for a broader pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. One particularly interesting discovery was a series of emails between Brenda and a local real estate developer named Craig Sutherland. The emails, which we obtained through the discovery process, suggested that Craig wanted to acquire several properties in our neighborhood for redevelopment, and Brenda was helping him by making life difficult for targeted homeowners to encourage them to sell. My property was apparently on Craig's wish list. The location was prime, and combining it with 2 adjacent lots would create a parcel large enough for a small commercial development. Suddenly, the HOA's aggressive tactics made a lot more sense. This wasn't just about Brenda's ego or control issues. There was money involved, and potentially a lot of it. Marcus immediately filed an amended complaint, adding allegations of conspiracy and fraud. If we could prove that Brenda was deliberately using her HOA authority to benefit a private developer, that opened up an entirely new dimension of legal liability. The developer, Craig Sutherland, was not pleased to be dragged into the lawsuit. He hired his own attorney and filed motions trying to get himself dismissed from the case, arguing that he had done nothing wrong and that any actions taken by the HOA were solely the board's responsibility. The legal proceedings were getting complicated, but Marcus seemed energized by the challenge. "Frank, I think we have got them. If we can establish this connection between Brenda and the developer, the HOA's insurance company is going to pressure them to settle rather than risk a massive judgment." and Brenda herself could be facing criminal charges for corruption. The June hearing arrived, and the courtroom was more crowded this time. Several other homeowners who had been victims of Brenda's harassment showed up to support me, along with a reporter from the Henderson Home News who had gotten wind of the expanded allegations. Judge Gonzalez took her seat and immediately addressed both parties. "I have reviewed the amended complaint and the various filings. Mr. Goldstein, I am troubled by some of the allegations raised by the plaintiff. Does your client have any relationship with Craig Sutherland beyond what would be normal for an HOA president?" Richard Goldstein looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, my client has maintained that any communications with Mr. Sutherland were purely informational in nature and did not constitute any kind of conspiracy or improper arrangement." "That is not what I asked," the judge replied sharply. "I asked if there is a relationship beyond what would be normal. Yes or no? Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Sutherland have known each other socially for several years," Goldstein admitted. Marcus stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, we have evidence that shows Mrs. Morrison was actively coordinating with Mr. Sutherland to target specific homeowners, including my client, in order to pressure them into selling their properties to facilitate Mr. Sutherland's development plans. This goes far beyond a simple dispute over safety protocols. This is a deliberate scheme to abuse the HOA's authority for personal financial gain." The judge turned to Brenda, who was sitting ramrod straight in her chair, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Mrs. Morrison, you understand these are serious allegations. If proven, you could face criminal charges in addition to civil liability. Does the HOA wish to reconsider its position in this matter?" Before Goldstein could respond, Brenda stood up. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. I have done nothing wrong. Mr. Brennan is trying to distract from the fact that he is running a dangerous business in a residential neighborhood and refuses to provide basic safety information. Everything I have done has been in the best interests of the community." Judge Gonzalez was unimpressed. "Sit down, Mrs. Morrison. You will speak when your attorney advises you to do so. Mr. Goldstein, I am ordering the HOA to produce all communications between any board member and Mr. Sutherland for the past 3 years. You have 30 days. We will reconvene on July 20th to review those materials and determine if there is sufficient evidence of improper conduct to warrant further investigation. In the meantime, the temporary restraining order remains in effect, and I am expanding it to prohibit the HOA from issuing any new violations to Mr. Brennan for any reason, unless they can demonstrate that identical violations are being enforced against other homeowners with comparable circumstances." It was a significant victory, but I knew the fight was far from over. Brenda Morrison did not strike me as someone who would go down without a fight, and I worried about what she might do as she felt the legal walls closing in around her. My concerns proved justified sooner than I expected. 2 days after the hearing, I came home from a client meeting to find my mailbox had been vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "Leave" in large red letters across it. I called the police and filed a report, though I had no proof of who was responsible. A week later, someone slashed 2 of my tires while my car was parked in my driveway overnight. Again, no witnesses, no proof. The police took a report but said there was little they could do without evidence. I installed security cameras around my property, something I probably should have done months earlier. The cameras provided peace of mind, but they also captured something I never expected. On a Thursday night in late June, around 2 in the morning, my cameras caught a dark sedan driving slowly past my house. The car stopped, and a figure got out, approached my property, and appeared to be taking photos of my home with a flash camera. The person then got back in the car and drove away. I reviewed the footage the next morning and managed to capture a partial license plate number. I called Detective Brenda Morrison, no relation to Brenda, who had been assigned to investigate the earlier vandalism incidents. She ran the plate and came back with interesting news. "Mr. Brennan, that vehicle is registered to a private investigation firm here in Las Vegas. It appears someone has hired a PI to surveil your property. That is not illegal in itself, but combined with the pattern of harassment you have been experiencing, it adds another layer to your situation." "Can you find out who hired them?" I asked. "I can ask, but PI firms generally don't disclose their clients without a court order. You might want to mention this to your attorney, though. If the HOA or Mrs. Morrison hired this firm, that could be relevant to your case." Marcus filed a motion to compel disclosure of the PI firm's client, arguing that the surveillance was part of the ongoing harassment campaign. The judge agreed and ordered the firm to disclose who had hired them. The answer came back 2 weeks later: Craig Sutherland, the developer. He claimed he was simply conducting due diligence on properties he was interested in purchasing, but the timing and circumstances suggested otherwise. Marcus immediately amended our complaint to add claims of stalking and intimidation. The net was tightening around both Brenda and Craig, and I could sense their desperation growing. The July 20th hearing promised to be dramatic, as the HOA was required to produce all communications between board members and Craig Sutherland. What those communications revealed was stunning. Over 3 years, Brenda had received more than $20,000 in consulting fees from Craig's development company. The payments were structured to avoid obvious red flags, usually coming in amounts just under $10,000 to avoid certain reporting requirements. In exchange, Brenda had systematically targeted homeowners whose properties Craig wanted to acquire, using the HOA's enforcement powers to make their lives miserable until they sold. My situation was just the latest example of a pattern that had been going on for years. The emails showed Brenda and Craig discussing specific homeowners, strategizing about which violations to cite, and coordinating timing to maximize pressure. In one particularly damning email, Craig wrote, "Once Brennan gets hit with enough fines, he will cave like the others. Keep up the pressure on the propane thing. That seems to be making him sweat." Judge Gonzalez was visibly angry as she reviewed the materials. "This is one of the most egregious abuses of fiduciary duty I have encountered in my time on the bench. Mr. Goldstein, does the HOA have anything to say in response to these revelations?" Richard Goldstein looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Your Honor, the HOA board was not aware of Mrs. Morrison's relationship with Mr. Sutherland. As soon as this information came to light, the board voted to remove Mrs. Morrison from her position as president and to terminate her from the board entirely. The HOA wishes to cooperate fully with any investigation and to make this right with Mr. Brennan." "That is a start," the judge said. "But it does not change the fact that your organization allowed this to happen under its authority. Mr. Chen, what remedies is your client seeking?" Marcus stood. "Your Honor, my client is seeking compensatory damages for all legal fees incurred, emotional distress, lost business opportunities due to the time and stress of this matter, and punitive damages to send a message that this kind of abuse will not be tolerated. Additionally, we believe this matter should be referred to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation." "I agree completely," Judge Gonzalez said. "I am awarding Mr. Brennan summary judgment on his main claims." The demand for proprietary business information was clearly improper and illegal. The harassment campaign that followed his refusal to comply constitutes bad faith and malicious conduct. I am ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Brennan's legal fees in full, plus $100,000 in compensatory damages and $300,000 in punitive damages. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Nevada Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal conduct by both Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Sutherland. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Several of my neighbors who had attended the hearing came up to congratulate me and thank me for exposing Brenda's corruption. The reporter from the Henderson Home News was frantically taking notes, knowing this was going to be a major story. Brenda Morrison, who had been sitting pale and silent throughout the hearing, stood up and tried to leave quickly. But as she reached the courtroom doors, two men in suits approached her. One of them identified himself as an investigator with the Nevada Attorney General's office. "Mrs. Morrison, we would like to speak with you about your activities as HOA president. You are not under arrest, but we strongly advise you to retain legal counsel." She looked back at me, her face a mixture of rage and panic, before being escorted out of the courthouse. Craig Sutherland, who had tried to slip out unnoticed, was also intercepted by investigators. The aftermath of the hearing moved quickly. The Henderson Home News ran a front-page story about the corruption scandal, and other media outlets picked it up. The Nevada Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation, and within 2 months, both Brenda Morrison and Craig Sutherland were indicted on multiple charges including bribery, conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of authority. The HOA's insurance company settled with me for the full amount of the judgment, plus additional compensation to avoid further litigation. More importantly, several other homeowners who had been victims of Brenda's schemes came forward and filed their own lawsuits. The HOA ended up paying out over $2 million in total settlements. Brenda's trial took place the following spring. I was called as a witness to describe my experiences and the impact her actions had on my life and business. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence: emails, bank records, testimony from other victims, and the damning communications we had uncovered during discovery. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Brenda Morrison was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay substantial restitution. Craig Sutherland, who cooperated with prosecutors and testified against Brenda, received 3 years probation and a massive fine, but avoided prison time. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA underwent a complete restructuring. New board members were elected. Bylaws were revised to include better oversight and accountability measures, and the organization hired professional management with actual expertise in community association governance, rather than just following Brenda's autocratic whims. For me, life gradually returned to normal, though I remained cautious. The experience had taught me important lessons about standing up for your rights, even when facing seemingly overwhelming opposition. My business actually thrived after the publicity from the case, as several companies reached out specifically because they appreciated my stance on protecting proprietary information. Sarah was proud of me for fighting back, and I think the experience taught her valuable lessons about integrity and perseverance. One evening, several months after everything was resolved, she brought up the subject while we were having dinner. "Dad, I have been thinking about everything that happened with the HOA. At first, I was scared they were going to take our house or bankrupt us or something, but you never backed down even when things got really bad. Why?" I thought about it for a moment. because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than taking the easy path. If I had just given them what they wanted, it would have destroyed my business and set a terrible precedent. Plus, I would have been letting Brenda Morrison get away with abusing her authority. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when it is scary or difficult. "I am glad you did," she said. "And I am glad we didn't have to move. I like it here, especially now that crazy Brenda is gone," I laughed. "Sarah." "What? That is what everyone in the neighborhood calls her now." "Well, called her." Past tense. The new HOA board was a dramatic improvement. They focused on actual community needs like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, rather than inventing violations and harassing homeowners. They even apologized formally for what I had endured and asked if I would be willing to serve on an advisory committee to help prevent future abuses. I declined the committee invitation, having had quite enough of HOA governance to last a lifetime, but I appreciated the gesture. What I did accept was an invitation to speak at a state legislative hearing about HOA reform. The scandal had prompted several Nevada lawmakers to propose new legislation that would create better oversight of homeowners associations and stronger protections for homeowners facing harassment. My testimony focused on the need for clear limits on HOA authority, particularly when it came to demanding access to private business information or using enforcement powers selectively to target specific homeowners. I shared my story and how OSHA intervention had been crucial in validating my position. Several other homeowners from different communities also testified about their experiences with abusive HOAs. The legislation ultimately passed with bipartisan support. It included provisions requiring HOAs to follow consistent enforcement standards, creating an appeals process for homeowners facing violations, and establishing penalties for board members who abused their authority for personal gain. It was not perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. As time passed, the whole ordeal began to feel like a bad dream. I still lived in the same house in Meadowbrook Heights, but the atmosphere in the neighborhood was completely different. People were friendlier, less anxious about arbitrary violations, and more willing to be actual neighbors rather than just following rules. I ran into Susan Martinez, the former board member who had questioned Brenda during that fateful meeting at the grocery store one afternoon. She stopped me in the produce section. "Frank, I just wanted to say thank you. I sat on that board for 2 years and watched Brenda abuse her position, but I was too afraid to really stand up to her. When you fought back, it gave others the courage to speak up too. She should never have gotten away with what she did for as long as she did." "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked, not accusingly, just curious. She sighed. "Fear, mostly. Brenda made it clear that anyone who opposed her would become her next target. I saw what she did to other people, and I didn't want to go through that. I know that is cowardly, and I am not proud of it. But watching you fight her despite everything she threw at you, it made me realize that sometimes you have to take a stand regardless of the personal cost." "Well, I appreciate you speaking up when you did. That question you asked about consulting the HOA attorney, that was the first crack in her armor. It showed the judge that not everyone on the board supported her actions." We chatted for a few more minutes before going our separate ways, but the conversation stuck with me. How many other people had known what Brenda was doing but stayed silent out of fear? How much suffering could have been prevented if someone had spoken up sooner? These were questions without easy answers, but they reinforced my belief that I had done the right thing by fighting back. Sometimes the cost of going along with injustice is higher than the cost of opposing it, even when that opposition comes with significant personal sacrifice. My business continued to grow. The publicity from the case had been overwhelmingly positive, with many people and companies impressed by my commitment to protecting proprietary information, even under extreme pressure. I hired 2 additional consultants to help handle the increased workload, and we moved into a small office space in Henderson, rather than continuing to work solely from home. Ironically, moving my primary business operations out of the house eliminated any legitimate basis the HOA might have had for concern, though the new board never raised any issues. They understood that the previous demands had nothing to do with legitimate safety concerns and everything to do with Brenda's corruption. Sarah graduated from high school and got accepted to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she planned to study business law. She said the whole HOA experience had inspired her to become an attorney who could help people fight back against institutional abuse. I could not have been prouder. On the 1-year anniversary of Judge Gonzalez's ruling, I was sitting on my back patio with a beer, reflecting on everything that had happened. My phone rang. It was Marcus Chen. "Frank, I just got some interesting news. Remember those other homeowners who filed lawsuits against the HOA after your case went public? Of course. Last I heard there were at least 5 separate cases. All settled. The HOA's insurance company decided it was cheaper to pay everyone off than to keep litigating. Total payout was around $3 million. Your case really opened the floodgates. That is great news for those families. They deserved compensation for what they went through. There is more," Marcus continued. "The Attorney General's office is looking at criminal charges against 2 other HOA boards in Nevada for similar schemes. Your case set a precedent that is having ripple effects across the state. HOA boards are suddenly a lot more cautious about abusing their authority because they know there can be real consequences." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about the journey from that first certified letter to where I was now. It had been exhausting, expensive, and stressful, but ultimately worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone else who would be protected by the precedents we had set and the reforms that followed. The propane safety protocols that Brenda had demanded, the proprietary information that started this whole mess, were now being used by 3 Fortune 500 companies and 2 federal agencies. They represented years of work and expertise, and they were making workplaces safer across the country. If I had surrendered them to the HOA's illegitimate demands, who knows how that information might have been misused or how much damage it could have done to my business. OSHA support had been crucial. Their letter confirming that the information was proprietary and protected had given me the confidence to stand firm and provided the legal foundation for everything that followed. It was a reminder that sometimes the system actually works, that there are protections in place for people who know their rights and are willing to fight for them. As the sun set over Henderson, painting the Nevada sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I raised my beer in a silent toast. To standing up for what is right, to refusing to be bullied, and to the hope that what I went through would make things better for others facing similar situations. The house next door had new owners, a young couple with a toddler. They had moved in a few months earlier, and I had helped them get settled, sharing the story of what had happened with the previous HOA board. They were appropriately horrified, but also reassured that the new board was nothing like the old one. The husband, David, had asked me for advice when they were considering buying the house. "Should we be worried about the HOA here? We have heard horror stories." I had been honest with him. Every HOA is different. The one here now is fine. They focus on actual community needs and do not harass people. But you should always read the bylaws carefully. before buying into any HOA community, and make sure you understand what powers they have and how they can be limited. And if they ever overstep their authority, do not be afraid to fight back. Document everything, get legal advice early, and do not let them bully you into compliance. It had felt good to pass along that advice, to help someone else avoid the nightmare I had gone through. Knowledge and vigilance were the best defenses against HOA abuse. My daughter came out onto the patio, holding her own drink, a soda rather than a beer. She sat down next to me. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just reflecting on everything." This whole experience really changed our lives. For the better though, right? I mean, it was terrible while it was happening, but now things are good. Better than they were before, actually. She was right. The experience had been awful, but it had also led to positive changes, not just for us but for many others. The legislative reforms, the increased awareness of HOA abuse, the financial compensation for victims, even the criminal consequences for Brenda and Craig, all of it added up to something meaningful. "Yeah," I said, "for the better. Sometimes you have to go through hard times to get to better ones." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken and the stars begin to appear. Life had returned to a peaceful routine, the kind of ordinary calm that I had taken for granted before the HOA nightmare began. Now I appreciated it more deeply, understanding how quickly things could go wrong when someone with power decided to abuse it. The legal bills had been substantial, even with the eventual reimbursement. There had been nights when I laid awake worrying about money, about losing the house, about whether I was making the right decisions. But I had never seriously considered giving up or giving Brenda what she wanted. Some lines you just do not cross. Some principles are worth defending regardless of the cost. The funny thing was, the whole situation had made me a better businessman. I had learned the importance of documenting everything, of having good legal counsel on retainer, of understanding my rights and being prepared to defend them. These lessons had served me well in subsequent business dealings, and had even become part of the training I provided to my own employees. Several months later, I got a letter from Brenda Morrison. It had been forwarded through several addresses before reaching me, as she was no longer living in the neighborhood or even in Nevada. The letter was short and stiff, clearly written at the advice of her attorney as part of her restitution requirements. "Mr. Brennan, I am writing to apologize for my actions as HOA president and the harm they caused you. My behavior was inappropriate and illegal, and I take full responsibility for the consequences you suffered as a result. I hope you can accept this apology and move forward with your life. Sincerely, Brenda Morrison." It was not exactly heartfelt, but I appreciated the gesture nonetheless. I did not respond to the letter. There was nothing more to say. She had faced the consequences of her actions through the legal system, and that was enough for me. I had no interest in revenge or rubbing her face in what had happened. I just wanted to move on with my life. The Meadowbrook Heights community continued to improve under new leadership. The HOA actually became what it was supposed to be, an organization that maintained common areas, organized community events, and enforced reasonable standards consistently and fairly. It was amazing what a difference competent, ethical leadership made. I even ended up becoming friends with some of the new board members, particularly the new president, James Fletcher, a retired engineer who approached HOA governance with the same systematic thinking he had applied to his professional career. He often sought my input on proposed policies, wanting to make sure they were reasonable and would not inadvertently harm homeowners. "The thing I learned from your case," James told me over coffee one morning, is that an HOA should serve the community, not rule it. Our job is to maintain property values and quality of life, not to micromanage how people live in their own homes. That means picking our battles carefully and always asking whether enforcement actually serves a legitimate community interest. It was refreshing to hear an HOA president talk that way. Under James's leadership, the number of violation notices issued dropped by over 70%, not because standards were abandoned, but because the focus shifted to serious issues rather than petty complaints. Homeowner satisfaction increased dramatically, and the neighborhood actually felt like a community again rather than a police state. 2 years after the trial, I was asked to speak at a national conference on homeowner association reform. The conference was in Denver, Colorado, and brought together legislators, attorneys, HOA management professionals, and homeowners' rights advocates from across the country. My presentation focused on the intersection of business rights and homeowner rights, using my experience as a case study in how HOAs could overstep their authority when board members had undisclosed conflicts of interest. The audience was engaged and asked thoughtful questions afterward. One attendee, a legislator from California, approached me during the lunch break. "Mr. Brennan, your story is remarkably similar to what is happening in several communities in my district. HOA boards are being used as tools by developers to pressure homeowners into selling. Do you have any advice for how we can address this legislatively?" I shared my thoughts about the need for mandatory disclosure of board members' financial interests, stricter oversight of HOA enforcement actions, and clear penalties for abuse of authority. I also emphasized the importance of protecting business operations from HOA interference, noting that many people ran home-based businesses and needed assurance that HOAs could not simply demand access to proprietary information without legitimate cause. The conversation continued throughout the afternoon, and I exchanged contact information with several people who were working on HOA reform in their own states. It felt good to contribute to broader change beyond just my own situation. Flying home to Nevada that evening, I thought about how much had changed in just a few years. I had gone from being a relatively anonymous small business owner to someone whose case had influenced state legislation and national conversations about HOA governance. It was never something I sought or wanted, but if my experience could help others avoid similar situations, then the whole ordeal had served a larger purpose. Sarah was waiting at the airport when I landed, having borrowed my car to pick me up. During the drive home, I told her about the conference and the conversations I had had with legislators and advocates. "Dad, you are kind of famous in the HOA reform world," she said with a grin. "I Googled you after you left for Denver. Your case comes up in like a dozen articles about HOA abuse and corruption. I would prefer to be famous for my actual work rather than for getting into a fight with my HOA," I replied. "But I guess you do not always get to choose what you are known for." "Well, I think it is cool. You stood up to corruption and won. That is something to be proud of." She was right, of course. Despite all the stress and difficulty, I had stood up for my rights and prevailed. More importantly, the precedent set by my case had protected others and led to meaningful reforms. That was worth being known for. The years continued to pass peacefully. My business thrived. Sarah graduated from college and got accepted to a prestigious law school, and life in Meadowbrook Heights remained calm under competent HOA leadership. The whole ordeal gradually became a story I told occasionally rather than an ongoing source of stress. But I never forgot the lessons learned. I maintained meticulous documentation of all business activities, kept excellent relationships with my attorney and other professional advisors, and stayed informed about my legal rights in various contexts. I also made a point of speaking up when I saw injustice, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. One evening, about 5 years after everything started, I was sorting through old files and came across the original letter from Brenda Morrison demanding my propane safety protocols. I read it again, remembering the shock and anger I had felt that day. The letter seemed almost quaint now, a relic from a difficult period that had ultimately led to positive changes. I kept the letter, though, along with all the other documents from the case. They were part of my history, evidence of a battle fought and won, and a reminder of why principles matter even when defending them is costly. Sarah came home that weekend from law school, and we had dinner together. She was taking a class on business law and told me about a case study they had discussed involving HOA overreach and proprietary information. "Dad, you will never guess what case we studied in class this week." I had a pretty good idea. "Let me guess. Morrison versus Brennan. How did you know?" "Because it has been cited in several legal publications as a precedent for limits on HOA authority and protection of business trade secrets. I get notifications occasionally when it is referenced in legal filings." She laughed. "It is so weird studying a case that happened to my own dad. My professor had no idea I was related to you until I mentioned it after class. She was really impressed by how you handled everything." "What did she say?" "That you did everything right. Got legal advice early, documented everything, stood firm on your principles, and used the appropriate legal channels rather than escalating unnecessarily." She said it was a textbook example of how to fight back against institutional overreach. Hearing that from a law professor was gratifying. I had questioned many of my decisions during the ordeal, wondering if I was being too stubborn or if there was a better way to handle things. Knowing that legal professionals considered my approach sound was validating. "The key thing," I told Sarah, "was recognizing early that this was not really about safety or legitimate HOA concerns. It was about power and money. Once I understood that, it became clear that giving in would not end the problem. It would just embolden Brenda to continue abusing her authority. Sometimes you have to draw a line and defend it. I hope I have that kind of courage when I am a lawyer," she said. "It is easy to talk about defending principles in class. Actually doing it when there are real consequences is a lot harder." "You will," I assured her. "You have already shown that kind of integrity in your own life. When the time comes, you will do the right thing." As the evening wound down and Sarah headed back to her apartment near campus, I reflected on how fortunate I had been despite everything. Yes, the HOA ordeal had been terrible, but I had survived it, prevailed, and even helped create positive change. I had a thriving business, a wonderful daughter, a comfortable home in a community that had learned hard lessons about good governance, and the satisfaction of knowing I had stood up for what was right. The propane safety protocols that started this whole mess were still protecting workers and facilities across the country. They remained proprietary, carefully guarded trade secrets that gave my company its competitive edge. Brenda Morrison's attempt to force disclosure had failed completely, and the legal precedent established by my case had protected other business owners in similar situations. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had just given in to the initial demand. Would Brenda have stopped there, or would she have found other ways to harass me until I sold my property to Craig Sutherland's company? Would other homeowners have continued to suffer under her corrupt regime? Would the legislative reforms have happened without the publicity from my case? These were unknowable counterfactuals, but I suspected that giving in would have led to worse outcomes in the long run. Bullies rarely stop when you surrender to their demands. They just escalate, emboldened by success. By fighting back, I had not only protected myself but had helped expose a pattern of corruption that had harmed many others. The sun was setting again over Henderson. Another beautiful Nevada evening. I poured myself a drink and went out to the patio, my favorite spot for reflection. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, exactly what a residential community should be. A neighbor walked by with his dog and waved. I waved back, exchanging pleasantries about the weather. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind of simple neighborhood interaction that should be normal but had been impossible during the height of the HOA conflict when everyone was tense and afraid of arbitrary enforcement. That ordinariness was precious. It was what I had fought to preserve, not just for myself but for everyone in the community. The right to live peacefully in your own home, to run a legitimate business without illegitimate interference, to be treated fairly and consistently by those entrusted with community governance. These were not revolutionary demands. They were basic expectations that should not have required years of legal warfare to secure, but they had required that fight, and I had been willing to wage it. That was the real lesson of the whole experience. Sometimes doing what is right requires sacrifice and struggle. Sometimes you have to be willing to risk what you have to protect what matters. And sometimes, if you are very fortunate, that struggle leads not just to personal victory, but to broader positive change that benefits many others. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, I thought about Brenda Morrison serving her prison sentence somewhere, about Craig Sutherland trying to rebuild his damaged reputation, about the legislative reforms spreading across the country, about the homeowners who had received compensation for their suffering, about my daughter studying law and preparing to fight her own battles for justice, about my thriving business and the protected protocols that made it successful. It all came back to that one certified letter and my decision to stand firm rather than surrender. One moment, one choice, rippling outward into consequences neither Brenda nor I could have imagined when this all began. She had thought she could bully me into compliance like she had done with others. I had thought I was just protecting my business interests. Neither of us realized we were setting in motion events that would change HOA governance across Nevada and influence national conversations about homeowner rights. The glass in my hand was empty. I went inside, rinsed it out, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow was another day, another opportunity to build on what I had learned and accomplished. The past was settled, the lessons were learned, and the future was full of possibility. It was a good place to be, hard-earned and deeply appreciated. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt profound gratitude not for what I had been through, but for what I had become because of it. And for the small part I had played in making things better for others facing similar battles.